My Emil tried to kick me out, but the lease was in my name. Some mornings begin with coffee. Others begin with the sound of someone trying to erase you from your own life. That morning, I was folding laundry in the apartment I had built with my own hands when I heard the front door open. No knock, no warning, just the sharp clack of designer heels on hardwood, followed by the familiar voice of Lucille Rivera echoing down the hallway like a verdict. She didn't come to visit. She came to decide who belonged, and apparently it wasn't me. Not anymore. My name is Camila Cabello. I'm 31 years old, a senior content producer at a mid-sized creative agency in Chicago. I live in a renovated one-bedroom loft I designed myself, down to every exposed beam and industrial sconce. It wasn't big, but it had character. It had light. It had meaning. 3 years ago, it also had Ethan Rivera, the man I thought I would marry. We met at an industry event hosted by a media startup. I was leading a storytelling workshop. He was speaking on brand psychology. We stayed after, debated campaign ethics over overpriced cocktails, and ended the night laughing in the snow outside the train station. It was simple. It was real. It wasn't supposed to get complicated. Ethan came from a different world. His mother, Lucille, was a name in Chicago's PR circles, the kind of woman whose signature scent arrived in a room before she did. She had founded one of the city's most exclusive image consultancy firms back in the 90s and carried herself like the skyline owed her something. Her husband, James, had retired early from a successful career in finance. Ethan was their only son. Private schools, internships at Vogue-level agencies, summers in Maine, connections that never needed to be earned. I didn't grow up like that. My parents owned a secondhand bookstore in Oak Lawn. My best networking tool was kindness and hard work, and coffee I brewed myself. When Ethan and I moved in together, we chose this apartment not because it impressed anyone, but because it felt like us. It was tucked between a park and a brewery, walking distance to both our offices, with tall ceilings and brick that still smelled like the old garment factory it once was. Ethan helped pick the couch. I found the vintage record shelf at a flea market. Naomi, my best friend and an interior designer, helped me refinish the dining table. We made this place a home. It wasn't a showpiece. It was real. The first time Lucille visited, she was cordial but clearly unimpressed. She stepped in like she was entering a pop-up shop and commented on the lack of cohesive theme. She used the phrase urban transitional like it was a diagnosis. I smiled, offered her a drink, and let her talk. At the time, I thought maybe she just needed space to adjust. I told myself she didn't know me yet, that she'd warm up. I was wrong. Over time, her visits became inspections. She'd drop by on the way to a client and linger in the doorway like she was giving herself permission to stay. She'd rearrange the succulents on the windowsill, critique my choice of throw pillows. Once, I caught her holding my resume, which had been printed for an agency pitch and left on the desk. She looked at it, then looked at me and said nothing. The silence said everything. Ethan saw it. I knew he did, but he always said, "That's just my mom," as if that explained it, as if it excused the slow erosion of respect, the passive jabs about my career, my wardrobe, even my taste in cookware. I swallowed it. I smiled. I stayed quiet, because I believed that love meant endurance, that if I was patient, I could prove her wrong. I didn't realize that the person I was trying to prove myself to had no interest in seeing me at all. Then came the layoffs. Ethan lost his job when the agency merged. He was stunned. I wasn't. I'd seen the signs, but I stood by him. We reviewed budgets. We cut expenses. When the lease renewal came up and Ethan's credit had taken a hit, I signed the new agreement in my name only. It was the practical choice. We were still a team, or at least, I thought we were. Which brings me back to that morning. Lucille, standing in the entryway of our apartment, in tailored slacks and quiet fury, scanning the room like it was a crime scene. "This isn't working," she said. "Ethan needs space to reset. And frankly, I think it's time you pack up." Her voice was calm. Her message was not. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. She thought she had already won. What she didn't know was that I had something in the drawer beneath the Wi-Fi router, a copy of the lease, with only one name on it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I didn't flinch. I just stood there. One hand resting lightly on the edge of the dining table, Ethan and I had refinished together, and watched Lucille assert her version of the truth with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Her words were sharp, wrapped in polite phrasing, like invitations laced with poison. She believed this space belonged to her son. She believed I was an accessory that could be replaced. What she didn't expect was that I had already prepared for this moment, not out of paranoia, but because people like her never really hide their intentions. They just wait until they think no one can stop them. She moved toward the bedroom like she was checking inventory, muttering something about Ethan's things needing to be packed efficiently. I followed her, quietly pulled open the second drawer of the hallway cabinet, and returned with the lease folder. I placed it on the kitchen island, directly in her line of sight. "Before you make any more plans," I said calmly, "you should probably look at this." She turned, her brow arched with the kind of suspicion that only appears when entitlement meets resistance. She unfolded the lease slowly, perhaps expecting to see her son's name beside mine. When she reached the signature page and saw only mine, she went silent, for the first time in a very long time. Lucille Rivera was without words. "I signed the lease last fall," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Ethan's credit didn't qualify, and the landlord wanted a clean application, so I took it on." Her eyes flicked back to the paper, then to me. "But you didn't tell me that," she said. And the words landed with a faint tremble that surprised us both. "No," I replied, "because I didn't think I owed you that explanation." She tried to recover, adjusting her scarf like it could somehow reset the balance of power. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's about what's best for Ethan." But I had already learned that when someone says it's not personal, it always is. Ethan arrived home an hour later, breathless from the cold and confusion. He had 6 missed calls from his mother, none of which he returned. When he saw the lease still sitting open on the counter, he went pale. "Did you tell her?" he asked. I nodded once. She showed up uninvited and told me to leave. I thought she should know who actually lives here. He didn't defend her. He didn't defend me either. He sat down slowly and stared at the hardwood floor like it held answers to questions he didn't want to face. I poured 2 glasses of water and waited. "Did you let her believe the apartment was yours?" I asked quietly. He hesitated just long enough for the answer to become obvious. "She kept saying you were using me," he finally admitted. "I thought if she believed I was taking care of everything, she'd back off." There it was, the lie under the lie. He wasn't trying to protect me. He was trying to protect her image of him. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for over a year and saw a stranger. Not cruel, not manipulative, just afraid. afraid of disappointing the woman who had raised him with conditions instead of warmth. "Cam," he said, reaching for my hand. I never meant for this to happen. I let him hold it, but the silence between us had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of choices he hadn't made, and ones I was now going to have to. The next few days passed in an uneasy fog. Lucille didn't return. Ethan kept his distance, busying himself with freelance work and late-night walks he claimed were to clear his head. I didn't argue. I needed space too. I went back to work at the agency like nothing had happened, smiled at clients, hit deadlines, and answered emails with a professionalism I no longer recognized in my own home. Naomi noticed first. "Your energy's off," she said over lunch, "like you're half present." I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me. One night, I came home to find Ethan sitting on the floor, surrounded by opened boxes. "I thought maybe we could reconfigure the living room," he said hopefully, "make it feel new again." But no rearrangement would fix what had broken. The problem wasn't the space. It was the quiet agreement we had both entered into, where I gave more and he took it for granted, where I made things work and he let me. He wasn't malicious. He was just shaped by a world that taught him someone would always clean up the pieces. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the years I had spent shrinking to make space for other people's comfort. I thought about how easily I had accepted the role of peacekeeper, the woman who smooths over chaos with a steady voice and a well-cooked dinner. But there's a kind of anger that doesn't explode. It settles, like dust, until one day you see it covering everything and realize you can't breathe. And that was the moment I stopped apologizing, even in silence. It wasn't a single fight that unraveled us. It was the long stretch of silence that followed. Ethan and I still lived together, still shared space, still remembered which drawer held the scissors and which days the trash went out. But something fundamental had shifted, and we both felt it in the way we moved around each other like polite strangers. We stopped making dinner together. We stopped leaving little notes on the fridge. Conversations became short, mostly practical, and our laughter, which used to fill the apartment like sunlight, had become a rare visitor. I knew Ethan was trying. He offered to take on more chores, started applying to jobs more consistently, even suggested a weekend away, like a reboot would fix something that had never fully started right. But I also knew that until he faced what was really broken, no reset button could work. One Saturday afternoon, Naomi came over to help me set up for an upcoming client shoot. She noticed Ethan's absence immediately. "He's running errands," I said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Alone?" she asked. I nodded. "We're giving each other space." Naomi didn't press, but before she left, she looked around the apartment and said something I couldn't shake. "You built this space for two people, but lately, it feels like you're the only one still living in it." That night, I sat in the living room alone, looking at the faded edge of the rug we had once chosen together, and realized she was right. I had poured my time, energy, and trust into this relationship, believing that love could be enough to carry the weight of imbalance, but love without accountability slowly becomes exhaustion. The next morning, Ethan surprised me by asking if we could talk. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table where so many of our shared memories had taken place. But this time, there was no meal, no background music, just two people trying to reach across a growing distance. I talked to my therapist. He began, his voice steady but low, and I realized I've been living two lives, one where I pretend I'm the version of myself my mother approves of, and one where I actually try to be happy. I listened, for once. He wasn't making excuses or asking me to carry the weight of his guilt. He was just naming it. I grew up thinking love had to be earned by achievement. He said that my worth came from being the golden son, and when I lost my job, I felt like I lost my identity. Watching you step up and hold everything together made me grateful, but it also made me ashamed. I let my mother believe things that weren't true because I thought protecting her illusion of me was more important than protecting you. I didn't interrupt. I let his words hang in the air because they weren't just an apology. They were the beginning of truth. I know I failed you, he said, finally meeting my eyes. And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I'm ready to rebuild, not just with you, but with myself. In that moment, I saw not the man I had fallen for at the media event years ago, but someone deeper, stripped of pretense, standing quietly in the rubble of his old identity and choosing to build something new. I nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. The following weeks were slow, but they were different. Ethan set boundaries with Lucille for the first time. He told her that unannounced visits were no longer acceptable and that she needed to speak to both of us with respect if she wanted a relationship moving forward. She responded with denial, then silence, then short, clipped messages that slowly softened. He began seeing a career coach, took freelance gigs seriously, and stopped measuring his worth by the prestige of the paycheck. We started talking again, not about work or groceries or deadlines, but about us, about who we had been and who we wanted to become. Then, one afternoon, as I wrapped up a shoot in the agency studio, Ethan called. His voice was unusually quiet. "She's moving out," he said. "My dad's filing for divorce. Apparently, it's been coming for years." I didn't say much. I knew what this meant. Lucille's carefully crafted world was finally cracking. Within days, word spread that James had been under investigation for financial misconduct. Lucille's firm lost 3 major clients. Their lakeshore house was quietly listed for sale. For a woman who once defined herself by control, image, and perfection, the collapse was almost cinematic. A week later, Ethan came home with an unreadable expression. "She doesn't have anywhere to go," he said. "Her assets are frozen. She can't find a place to rent. Bad credit, no steady income." He looked down at his hands. "She asked if she could stay here, just for a while." I stared at him, letting the weight of that sentence sink in. The woman who tried to evict me from my own home was now asking to move in. He waited for my answer, not pushing, not pleading, just waiting. I could feel my heart harden and soften all at once. I had every reason to say no, and yet, some part of me also saw the irony and the choice it presented. "I'll think about it," I said finally. And I meant it, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but because I wanted to be sure that whatever I chose next would not come from reaction, but from clarity. I gave myself 3 days to think, not out of spite, and not to make Ethan sweat, but because I knew the choice I was about to make would shape more than just the next few months. It would reshape the story I told myself about who I was. I wasn't the same woman Lucille tried to intimidate a year ago. I wasn't the woman who needed approval, or to be liked, or even to be understood. But I also wasn't someone who believed in revenge disguised as dignity. If I said yes, it would be on my terms, and I needed to be absolutely sure that I could live with the consequences. On the 4th morning, I brewed coffee early and waited for Ethan to wake up. When he stepped into the kitchen, hair still messy, eyes half closed, I slid a notebook across the counter. It had 6 rules: Clear ones, chores, boundaries, financial contribution if possible, shared spaces, no unannounced guests, and above all, respect spoken and unspoken. Ethan read them slowly, then looked up. So, that's a yes, I nodded. She can stay. 1 month. Then we reassess. His shoulders dropped, not from relief exactly, but from the weight of a choice that came with terms he didn't expect. I didn't say it, but he knew. This wasn't a gift. It was a boundary I was willing to test. Lucille moved in 2 days later. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Gone were the cashmere capes and patent leather handbags. She wore a neutral sweater and practical flats. Her hair had grown out, roots visible. The salon highlights faded into something less precise. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature but in presence, like the air around her had stopped bending to her will. She stepped inside with the hesitancy of someone walking into a courtroom, unsure whether she was on trial or being pardoned. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said. Her voice clipped, but genuine. "I know you didn't have to." I nodded once, showed her to the spare room, and reminded her gently of the shared calendar on the fridge. She didn't argue. She didn't push. She unpacked in silence. That evening, we ate dinner at the same kitchen table where she had once stood demanding I leave. She complimented the meal without sarcasm and offered to wash the dishes. I let her, but I watched carefully, not because I didn't trust her hands, but because I didn't yet trust the silence between us. The first week was awkward, a series of near collisions and unspoken edits. She tiptoed around the apartment, overly polite, overly restrained. She cleaned too much, folded towels that were already folded, reorganized the pantry 3 times. I caught her staring at the bookshelves once, her eyes lingering on a photo of Ethan and me from the early days. I said nothing. Neither did she. It wasn't tension exactly, but a kind of suspended breath, like we were both waiting for the old version of her to surface or the new one to prove it wasn't an act. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I found her in the kitchen holding one of my favorite mugs, the handmade one Ethan gave me on my birthday, the one I never let anyone use. She had already filled it with tea and didn't seem to notice the significance until she caught my expression. She froze, realizing her mistake, then slowly set it down. "I didn't know," she said quietly. I took a breath. I wanted to snap, to make it about something bigger. But instead, I said, "That mug matters to me. Next time, just ask." She nodded, and for the first time, looked genuinely embarrassed. "I will," she said. "I'm sorry." And for the first time, I believe she meant it. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I walked into the kitchen and found her folding dish towels for the 3rd time. I leaned against the counter and said, "We can't do this if we're going to pretend." She blinked. "Pretend what?" I shrugged. "Pretend this is normal. Pretend we're fine. We're not. But maybe we could start with something real." She sat down, and for the first time, didn't try to control the narrative. She told me about her marriage, about the years she spent preserving an image while quietly unraveling behind the scenes, about the fear of losing not just status, but purpose. And I listened not out of obligation, but because I could hear, in the pauses between her sentences, the woman she used to be before she became someone else's performance. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it cracked something open. The next morning, she asked if she could help with one of my fundraising campaigns. "You know, I used to run event planning for 6-figure galas," she said. "Not that yours has to be that. Of course, It could have been a jab, but the tone wasn't condescending. It was careful, and when I said yes, she took it seriously. She worked quietly at the dining table, suggesting vendors, organizing spreadsheets, and reaching out to old contacts who still returned her calls. And for the first time, I saw her not as an antagonist, but as a woman trying, imperfectly, to rebuild her place in the world. It was strange, watching someone you used to brace yourself against become someone you could, cautiously, rely on. Lucille approached the campaign work with quiet precision. She didn't overstep, didn't offer sweeping solutions, or speak in sound bites like she used to. Instead, she asked questions, took notes, and followed my lead. She even suggested a few strategic contacts, and to my surprise, those connections responded politely, sometimes eagerly. One gallery curator, who had previously ignored my emails, replied within 20 minutes when Lucille forwarded the same pitch from her account. The old part of me wanted to bristle, to resent the influence she still had, but another part acknowledged that maybe this time it wasn't about power. Maybe she was using what she had to help, not to control. Ethan noticed the shift too. One evening, while we were organizing logistics for an event setup, he paused and said, "You two don't sound like enemies anymore." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached for another stack of name cards and said, "It doesn't feel like war anymore." And that was enough. There was no need to analyze every inch of progress. Sometimes, the peace speaks for itself. The event went better than expected. Lucille arrived early, dressed modestly but elegant, and stayed mostly behind the scenes. She made introductions when appropriate, but never drew attention to herself. She even corrected a vendor who misattributed the entire concept to her, redirecting credit to me without hesitation. I didn't think she even noticed me hearing that moment, but she did. That night, as we packed away equipment in the agency van, she handed me a paper bag with my favorite coffee beans and said, "You led something real today. You held the room without raising your voice." I could never do that. I thanked her. We didn't hug. We didn't suddenly become a fairy tale family. But I took the coffee bag and, with it, a quiet understanding. Over the next few weeks, our routines became less performative. She'd make breakfast some mornings without asking. I'd leave space on the counter for her tea. Ethan fell into an easier rhythm too, lighter than I'd seen him in months. His new job at a mid-sized analytics firm wasn't glamorous, but he came home with stories he enjoyed telling. He started drawing again in the evenings, something he hadn't done since college. I didn't say anything, just occasionally left sketch pads out where he could find them. Our relationship, which had once felt like a structure barely holding itself together, began to feel like a space again, one with room to grow. Then, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while Lucille was reviewing a vendor quote, we heard a knock at the door. I answered to find Madison, Ethan's ex-girlfriend, standing in the hallway with a bouquet of tulips and a voice pitched too high to sound casual. "I'm visiting a friend in the building," she said. Glancing past me into the apartment, saw Ethan's name on the mailbox, thought I'd say hi. Before I could respond, Lucille stepped into view. Madison's eyes widened. "Oh," she said, her smile faltering. "I didn't expect. All of you." Lucille didn't blink. Camila was gracious enough to let me stay here during a difficult chapter, she said evenly. "And I've learned a lot in this home, mostly about what it means to deserve it." Madison faltered, murmured something about catching up another time, and left without further commentary. After the door closed, I looked at Lucille. She didn't look smug, just calm, That girl always underestimated you, she said, and returned to her notes. I didn't reply, but that sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. There was something powerful about watching someone who once dismissed you now defend your place without hesitation, not performatively, not to score points, just because, somewhere along the line, the power had shifted and she no longer needed to be on top to feel valuable. By the third month of our unexpected living arrangement, things had stabilized. Lucille had picked up a part-time role assisting with gallery logistics downtown. The hours were irregular, but she came home visibly energized. She began talking about downsizing for real, not just out of necessity, but as a choice. I don't need a penthouse, she said one evening while browsing rentals on her tablet. I just want something walkable, and maybe a south-facing window. Ethan encouraged her gently, and I stayed quiet, recognizing her tone. She wasn't grieving what she'd lost anymore. She was beginning to imagine something new. We didn't pretend the past never happened, occasionally. Tension flared in small ways, a comment phrased poorly, a look that carried old assumptions, but each time, we both caught it sooner, named it faster, and let it pass with less residue. There was no magical forgiveness, just a slow, daily rebuild that asked us both to show up differently than we had before. The real shift came one morning when Lucille sat across from me with a folded letter in her hands. I've been asked to testify, she said. In the investigation. Your father, I asked. She nodded. They want to establish timelines, meetings. What I knew, I wasn't directly involved, but I saw more than I admitted before. I think it's time I stopped pretending that keeping quiet was loyalty. I looked at her for a long moment. Are you scared? She nodded, but not as scared as I used to be of being irrelevant. That was the day I stopped thinking of her as someone I had survived, and started seeing her as someone I had outgrown the need to fear. Lucille's decision to testify marked a quiet turning point in all of our lives. It wasn't a grand act of redemption, and she didn't talk about it like some noble sacrifice. She simply said she was tired of protecting the version of herself that stayed silent while things unraveled behind closed doors. The court appearance was brief, but the effect lingered. She described meetings she had overheard, irregularities she'd once dismissed as harmless, and conversations her husband had insisted were above her understanding. That admission alone said more about their marriage than any official transcript ever could. When the case moved forward and James was formally indicted, Lucille didn't gloat. She didn't even cry. She simply went home, made tea, and sat by the window without saying much at all. I think she needed to feel what life looked like when you stopped performing, even if only for yourself. Around that time, her gallery work expanded into something more stable. The new director admired her eye for presentation and asked her to consult on an upcoming exhibition. She approached it with the same sharp focus I remembered from our first uneasy campaign together, only this time with more vulnerability and less need to dominate. She asked me to review her drafts, listened without defensiveness, and even asked if I thought she was taking up too much space at home. I told her the truth. We built the space to hold more than one kind of person. I said, but it works better when we all remember to respect the furniture. She laughed softly at that, not the polished laugh she once reserved for boardroom banter or charity banquets, but a real one, slightly uneven. It sounded like relief. It reminded me of how complicated grace really is. You don't give it because someone deserves it. You give it because you've lived long enough to know how much harder life becomes when everyone stops trying. 6 months after she first arrived with 2 suitcases and a strained apology, Lucille received her first full paycheck from the gallery that night. She insisted on taking Ethan and me out to dinner, not to some pretentious place that required dry-cleaned clothes or quiet nods of approval from neighboring tables, but to a small Peruvian bistro we had discovered together. It was tucked between a laundromat and a bike repair shop and had cracked tile floors and the best lomo saltado I'd ever tasted. She wore a linen blouse and flat shoes, ordered confidently in Spanish with the server, and asked us, without preamble, "Do you think it's time I started looking for my own place?" Ethan looked at her, a little surprised but not confused. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I'm finally standing on ground I chose." Over the next few weeks, we toured apartments together. She didn't chase square footage or doorman buildings. She wanted sunlight, a small balcony, and a kitchen where she could cook without feeling like a guest in someone else's life. When she found a modest one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood near the lake, she signed the lease herself, filled out every form without asking Ethan for a co-signer, and packed without ceremony. Moving day was rainy, but no one complained. Ethan carried boxes. I handled the fragile items. Lucille supervised with quiet confidence, no longer needing to direct the entire show. Her new apartment was simple but thoughtful. The bookshelf wasn't curated for status anymore. It held books she actually read, photo frames with candid moments, and one framed print of a landscape she'd painted in college. I hadn't known she could paint. She hadn't thought it mattered until now. A week after she settled in, she invited us over for dinner. She cooked arroz con pollo, served it on mismatched plates, and lit candles without apology for the flickering. The living room had no centerpiece sofa or expensive rug, just 2 armchairs and a small table between them where she kept fresh flowers in an old glass bottle. At one point, she looked around the space and said, "I thought I'd feel sad about leaving, but honestly, I feel like I finally arrived." Back at home, Ethan and I talked about how strange it was to miss someone we had once dreaded, but it wasn't about proximity. It was about watching someone grow where they'd once only tried to control. Lucille had stopped trying to curate a life for other people and had finally started building one of her own. For Ethan, it was healing in a way neither of us had expected. Watching his mother break out of the mold she had trapped herself in helped him do the same. He no longer chased legacy or sought approval from people who only cared about image. He woke up earlier. He asked better questions. He told me he had finally stopped confusing success with performance. I believed him, not because he told me, but because I saw it in the way he celebrated my promotion without needing to measure it against his own. The day I was officially named Content Strategy Director, Lucille sent a handwritten card, no elaborate gift, no attempt to make it about her, just a note that said, "You've always known what matters. I'm just grateful you let me learn it beside you." The months that followed moved slowly, but they moved in the right direction, for the first time in years. There was no looming tension in the background, no unspoken comparisons, no carefully managed conversations designed to avoid a sudden shift in mood. Lucille had settled into her new apartment, and somehow, that space became more than just physical separation. It was emotional distance, too, the kind that gave each of us the breathing room to reflect without resentment. Ethan visited her occasionally, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. He'd stop by with groceries or help her set up a new shelf, and they'd talk not about money or appearances, but about books, memories, and small things that once got lost under the weight of her expectations. She kept showing up in ways that surprised me. on the weekend of my team's biggest client pitch. She sent over a handwritten note with a small paperweight in the shape of an acorn. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. On the back of the card, she wrote, "From small seeds, strong trees." I kept it on my desk long after the pitch was done. It reminded me that transformation doesn't always announce itself with applause. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and earned in the spaces in between. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan and I hosted a small dinner at our place. Just us and Naomi, who had helped paint this apartment back when we first moved in. Lucille asked if she could bring dessert. I said yes, expecting something store-bought or overly elaborate. Instead, she arrived with 2 loaves of banana bread and a small box of hand-picked teas. "Nothing fancy," she said, "just comfort." We sat around the table for hours, laughing, telling stories, letting the evening stretch longer than we meant to. Naomi pulled me aside before she left, smiled, and said, "I never thought I'd see that woman make banana bread, or listen without interrupting." The agency was growing too. With Lucille's help during the gallery fundraiser, several museum curators had started working with us on storytelling campaigns. Our creative strategy department expanded, and I was promoted to senior director. It wasn't just a title. It meant more decisions, more responsibility, and more influence. And this time, I didn't question whether I had earned it. I didn't shrink from the attention or feel the need to justify my presence in the room. I had walked through enough fire to know that resilience doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. Lucille surprised me again when she asked if I would review her own portfolio. She had been assembling a case study presentation for an open events role at a local nonprofit. It wasn't glamorous, and the salary wasn't impressive, but the mission was meaningful. They focus on underserved artists. She explained, people with raw talent but no exposure. I think I could help shape that visibility. I looked through her materials and gave honest notes. She took them without defensiveness, revised the copy, and practiced her pitch with more humility than I thought possible. When she got the job, she called me first. The real shift, though, came the night Ethan proposed. It wasn't at a restaurant or some orchestrated setup. He came home from work, nervous but clear-eyed, and waited until I finished a late meeting. I found him in the living room, pacing slowly, holding something behind his back. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he said, waiting for the perfect moment. But I realized we don't need perfection. We've already proven we can weather the imperfect parts. He knelt, pulled out a small velvet box, and opened it to reveal a ring that was completely unexpected. No diamond, no heirloom, just a unique emerald stone set in a handmade band, with both our birthstones etched subtly inside. "It's not what anyone else would choose," he said, "but it's what feels like us." I said yes, and we called Lucille that night. Her voice cracked when she answered. "You're sure?" she asked. Not out of skepticism, but from a kind of disbelief that this life, this version of her family, was really happening. She offered to help plan the wedding, but only if I wanted her to. I said yes, and to her credit. She didn't try to take over. She gave suggestions but never demands, offered help but not opinions, and followed our lead the way she had once insisted on leading everything. We chose a small ceremony at the sculpture garden of the museum I had worked with for years. The day was simple, warm, full of quiet joy. Lucille wore a soft green dress and cried without hiding it. And when the dance came, the one she once imagined Ethan would share With a different kind of woman, she leaned in and whispered something I'll never forget. I'm proud of the man he's become, and I'm proud of the woman he chose, not because of me, but often in spite of me. After the wedding, everything felt both quieter and more vivid. We returned to the apartment we had once fought to hold on to, now as husband and wife, and though the space hadn't changed, we had. The little moments began to feel sacred in their simplicity, sharing coffee while reviewing our schedules, laughing over a burnt dinner neither of us cared enough to fix, talking late into the night, not about problems, but about ideas, goals, future trips we hadn't planned but liked imagining. Lucille respected the space we had built, no longer calling daily or asking for updates. Instead, she wrote short emails every week, often ending with some small reflection or a photo she'd taken of street art or the lake in early morning light. She had started volunteering at a community arts center, working with teenagers from neighborhoods she had once driven through without really seeing. She helped them build portfolios, hosted mock interviews, and used her network to get their work featured in local galleries. When we visited one weekend, I watched her kneel beside a 17-year-old painter, gently adjusting the angle of a canvas and asking thoughtful questions about color and intention. There was no trace of performance in her voice, just presence. Later, she introduced us as family to a few of the students, and I saw the subtle pride in her eyes, not in herself, but in being connected to something real. One afternoon, I received a call from the gallery where she now worked part-time. They wanted to nominate her for a civic award honoring contributions to community arts education. I helped write the submission, not out of obligation, but because I knew the truth mattered. Lucille hadn't just turned her life around. She had chosen to stay consistent long enough for that change to mean something. She was no longer chasing redemption. She was living differently every day, without needing applause. The night before the awards dinner, she invited us over for soup and fresh bread. The apartment still smelled faintly of lavender and something roasted, and the shelves were filled with small objects that meant something to no one but her. A stone from her favorite hiking trail, a notebook of handwritten recipes, a framed note from one of the students that simply said, "Thank you for seeing me." She didn't brag about the nomination. In fact, she barely mentioned it. Instead, we talked about music, upcoming projects, and Ethan's recent decision to mentor junior analysts at his firm. After dessert, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," she said, "but only if you want it." It was a check, modest, but significant, a portion of what she had managed to protect from the divorce settlement. "It's not a debt," she added, "and not charity. Just something I want to contribute, because you're building something important, and I want to be part of it. This time in a way that feels right." I didn't say anything for a few seconds, not because I doubted her sincerity, but because I could feel how full the moment was, not with guilt or surprise, but with something that felt clean. I accepted it, not because we needed it, but because we had finally reached a place where generosity was no longer about power. Ethan and I used part of that money to start something small, an annual storytelling workshop for young artists in underserved schools. We called it the Quiet Start. Lucille helped coordinate the first one and stayed in the background, organizing schedules and snacks, making space for others to lead. She never tried to be the face of it, and I never asked her to be, but I saw how much it meant to her to be part of something honest, something she didn't have to shape into anything other than what it was. Months passed, and life continued in its unpredictable rhythm. Work got busy again. Ethan's firm expanded. I started speaking at industry events. We bought a second-hand car and adopted a stubborn cat named Leo, who preferred Lucille's lap to anyone else's. On Sundays, we rotated dinners between our homes, no longer as an obligation, but as a rhythm we all chose. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we ordered takeout. Always. We talked not carefully, not cautiously, just like people who had weathered enough to finally tell the truth without flinching. One evening, after a long day, I sat on the couch and looked around the apartment, the same space Lucille once tried to push me out of, the place I had once fought to protect out of principle. It now felt like the quiet beginning of everything that had changed, not just in her, but in me. And as I leaned back into the soft evening light, I realized the power of that moment didn't come from any grand victory. It came from the simple fact that the person who once tried to erase me from this home had helped rebuild something far more lasting inside it. We moved out of the apartment a year after the wedding. It wasn't planned around any milestone, no promotion, no pregnancy, just a growing sense that the space had served its purpose, and it was time for something new. We found a small townhouse on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, with trees that change color in the fall and neighbors who wave from their porches without expectation. The floors creaked, the backyard needed work, and the upstairs windows stuck when it rained. But we loved it. Not because it was perfect, but because we didn't need it to be. We weren't looking for symbols anymore, just a place that felt honest. Packing up the old apartment was unexpectedly emotional. Every corner held echoes of tension and tenderness, of fights we no longer repeated and laughter we had earned the hard way. I found the lease at the bottom of a drawer, the one with my name on it and no one else's, the paper that had once felt like a shield and now felt like a chapter. I almost threw it away, but something stopped me. I folded it gently and placed it inside a folder labeled Firsts, along with the Polaroid. Ethan took the night we signed it, blurry but full of pride. Not because we had conquered anything, but because we had stayed. Lucille came by the morning we moved. She brought bagels and fruit. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she remembered that I never liked to pack hungry. She sat on the floor among half-labeled boxes and helped me wrap dishes, careful with each plate like she understood now what it meant to care for someone else's life. At one point, she held up the old mug, the handmade one she once used without asking, and smiled. "Still your favorite?" she asked. I nodded. Always. She didn't ask to take anything. She didn't try to shape the moment. She just showed up, quietly, like someone who had learned that presence often means more than perfection. Our new house didn't have room for the past, but it didn't reject it either. We kept a few pieces of furniture, not because they matched, but because they had stories. The mismatched bookshelf Lucille once criticized became the centerpiece of our hallway. On its top shelf, next to our wedding photo and a plant Ethan forgot to water, I placed the acorn-shaped paperweight she gave me before my promotion. I didn't need to see it every day, but I liked knowing it was there. One evening, a few months after we had settled in, Lucille invited us to her apartment. She had just hosted a community art show at the center and wanted to share the experience. We arrived to find the living room filled with small canvases, poetry books stacked in corners, and a group of teenagers lingering over snacks, still glowing with the confidence of having been seen. Lucille moved among them effortlessly, not as a figure of authority, but as someone they trusted. She introduced us without fanfare. "This is my family," she said simply. "They've taught me more than any job ever did." I saw how the students looked at her, with a mixture of respect and ease. and I realized that for all the years she had chased approval in rooms filled with polished people, it was here, among raw voices and unfinished stories, that she had finally found her place. Later that night, after everyone had left, we sat with her on the balcony, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. She turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" I didn't answer right away, because I did, often, but not in the way people talk about triumph, not in terms of victories or karma, just in the quiet ways people change when they stop needing to be right and start choosing to be real. "I don't think we would have survived each other back then," I said finally, "but I'm glad we didn't give up." She smiled, not the tight smile she used to wear like armor, but the one that arrived now with less effort, less need. I almost lost everything chasing the version of life I thought I deserved. She said, "But you taught me what it looks like to earn something that lasts." That moment didn't feel cinematic. There were no violins, no dramatic wind, just a woman who had once tried to push me out of her son's life, now sitting beside me, holding nothing but the truth. And somewhere between that balcony and the walk home, I realized that forgiveness is not always about forgetting. Sometimes it's about remembering everything and still deciding to move forward anyway. 3 years after Lucille walked into my apartment and tried to evict me from my own life, we now share Sunday dinners like they were always meant to happen. Sometimes at our townhouse, sometimes at her place, sometimes at the gallery after a closing show when everyone's too tired to cook, but no one wants to be alone. They're not formal, no dress code, no power dynamics, just a table, food someone brought from home or picked up on the way, and conversation that feels more like breathing than performing. Ethan jokes that we became a family in reverse. First conflict, then honesty, then trust. One Sunday, while Lucille and I were drying dishes together in her kitchen, she reached across the counter and tapped the back of my hand gently. "Do you remember what I said to you that night after Madison left?" I nodded. I remembered every word. "I told you you were more formidable than I gave you credit for." She said, "And now," I asked, smiling, "now I admire that part of you. It used to scare me. I thought it would make my son small. I didn't realize it would actually make him whole." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't believe her, but because I did. And that belief, after everything, still surprised me. Sometimes I think about the version of me from years ago, the woman who thought respect had to be earned through silence, who believed if she was just good enough, calm enough, soft enough, the world would make room for her. She was wrong. The world doesn't always open for quiet goodness. Sometimes it needs you to plant your feet, hold your voice steady, and say, "This space is mine," and if you're lucky, the people who once tried to shut that door will eventually learn to knock. Lucille no longer needs our approval, and we no longer need her permission. That has made all the difference. Our relationship now exists without conditions. She calls when she's overwhelmed and doesn't pretend to have the answers. She asks for advice and doesn't fold it into control. She listens. She even apologizes without deflecting. Not often, but meaningfully. And in return, I offer the same. We don't erase the past. We let it live where it belongs. Not between us, but behind us. The day Ethan and I signed the final paperwork on the townhouse, I found myself driving back to the old apartment one last time. It was already vacant. The walls had been painted over. The shelves were gone. The light still came in strong through the east windows, but it felt colder without the warmth of memory. I stood in the middle of that space, and remembered everything. The night Lucille told me to pack my things, the moment I handed her the lease, the way my hand didn't shake. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was done trying to justify my existence. That lease had been more than a contract. It had been a quiet declaration of belonging, a moment where I stopped asking to be accepted and chose to stay rooted in my own worth. I don't know if Lucille would have changed without that confrontation. I don't know if Ethan and I would have made it if we hadn't stripped our relationship down to the foundation and rebuilt it without performance. What I do know is this sometimes. The story we think we're trapped in is just the setup for something more honest, more painful, and more necessary than we could have predicted. It's easy to believe people never change, and sometimes they don't. But every so often, they do not because they're cornered, but because they're finally still long enough to hear what life has been trying to tell them. Lucille didn't change overnight. She didn't become a saint or a victim. She became real, and in doing so, she made room for the rest of us to stop pretending too. Now, when I see her sitting beside Ethan at a gallery talk or helping a student choose their first exhibit title, I don't feel tension anymore. I feel something steadier, not forgiveness, not even closure, just a strange, quiet gratitude for the way we all chose to stay, even when it would have been easier to walk away, even when we didn't yet know how the story would end. My name is Camila Cabello, not the celebrity, just a woman who once stood alone in her kitchen while someone tried to tell her she didn't belong. And today, I share dinners and dreams and a life with that same someone because I didn't leave, because I stayed, because I knew, even then, that the story wasn't over. Have you ever stood your ground so firmly that someone who once doubted you had no choice but to respect you, or seen a relationship transform, not through force, but through quiet consistency? I'd love to hear your story, because sometimes the most powerful change doesn't begin with revenge. It begins with refusing to disappear.